What is the greatest fine I'll do it myself moment in history? My then wife had a small precancerous growth on her left hand that needed to be removed, but she has a phobia of needles due to an accident in her youth. A veterinarian went to inject a large syringe into a horse she was holding, but the horse moved at the last second and the syringe went completely through her right hand and into the horse. Since the damage was already done, the vet finished the inoculation before pulling the needle out of the horse and her hand. So, understandably, when they brought a small needle close to her left hand to anesthetize it, her hand started shaking uncontrollably. After telling her story, the anesthesiologist handed her the syringe and told her to do it herself. She did so with no problem. It seems that as long as she was in control of the situation, she had no fear. John Walsh's son was abducted from a Sears in 1981 and his decapitated head was found 2 weeks later. The rest of his body was never found. They were never able to pin the murder on anyone. John Walsh got involved in victim advocacy and started America's Most Wanted, helping capture more than 1,000 criminals, some of which were on the FBI's Most Wanted list. It was eventually determined, with minimal evidence, that a serial killer named Otis Toole was Adam's killer. To this day, department stores commonly have a code Adam, named after Walsh's son, to help locate children who were lost or abducted from public spaces. Edit: Adam Walsh was 6 when he was abducted and murdered. The guy who invented rubber gloves for surgeons was himself a doctor whose nurse, also his wife, was suffering from contact dermatitis from all the chemicals they used to create an antiseptic environment. So he designed some rubber gloves and asked Goodyear to make them for him, accidentally inventing the beginning of aseptic surgery in the process. Benedict Arnold. Horatio Gates was useless at the Battle of Saratoga, and the two men hated each other. Halfway through the battle, Gates relieved Arnold of his command. Seeing that the American counterattack was stalled, Arnold rode out and rallied the troops from the front, saving the day and directly leading to the British surrender. In the process, he was shot in his left leg, which was then crushed as his horse was also shot out from under him. When Gates' messenger finally arrived to order him to return back to headquarters, Arnold had to be carried back in a litter. The animosity between Gates and Arnold caused Gates to refuse to acknowledge that Arnold had participated in the battle at all. Gates was more astute politically, and the Continental Congress sided with Gates, which was a major contributory factor in Arnold's later treason. Meanwhile, Gates was given command of the Southern Army, led it to great failure, and was removed. After the war, Arnold allegedly asked what would happen if he returned to the US. He was told they would build a monument to his left leg and hang the rest of him. Shuji Nakamura inventing the blue LED. Basically, making the blue LED was a hard problem, and only having red and green means we couldn't have the full spectrum of colors like we have for TVs today. Nakamura was tasked with this research, and through the journey, had people dismiss him for not having a PhD at the time, and doubting him for pursuing a different method of LED manufacturing, which eventually did lead to success. He was also ordered to stop working on the problem by his company, but did it anyway. The linked Veritasium video explains it all perfectly and is worth the watch if you have the time. John von Neumann was one of the greatest mathematicians of all time. However, he kept being frustrated by the physicists never being able to build a properly working computer to do his calculations. So in 1945 he basically said fuck it, just do this, and described the architecture which is basically the foundation of all modern computers, which is referred to as von Neumann architecture. Dude was also part of the Manhattan Project, a pioneer of game theory, and did analyses which preceded the discovery of the structure of DNA. Absolute monster of an intellect. Benedict Arnold was sitting in his tent getting wasted, telling them not to chop off his leg while the Continental Army was getting routed in Saratoga. He said fuck it, I'll do it myself, and got back on his horse pissed drunk with a broken leg and rode to the front lines, rallied the troops, led a charge and won the battle. He was called the hero of Saratoga. Then they stuck him in a desk job, passed him over for promotion because they didn't want two commanders from the same colony and because his leg was messed up. So he plotted to surrender West Point to the British. Fuck that guy, but also yeah, you can kinda see why he might have been upset. And for a while, at least, he was certainly the hero of Saratoga. Hannibal crossing the Alps to take on the Romans and then subsequently annihilating multiple Roman armies and rampaging through Italy for nearly a decade has to be up there somewhere. It's a shame the rest of Carthage lost on its other fronts. John Stapp, Air Force doctor who was convinced that more pilots could survive if their seats didn't disintegrate on crash landings. He proved it by strapping himself into a Mythbusters-style rocket sled and not dying. His work led to safer planes and cars. By riding the decelerator sled, Stapp demonstrated that a human can withstand at least 46.2 G in the forward position with adequate harnessing. This is the highest known acceleration voluntarily encountered by a human, set on December 10, 1954. Stapp reached a speed of 632 miles per hour, 1,017 kilometers per hour, which broke the land speed record and made him the fastest man on Earth. The man who invented the automatic switchboard, switchboards used to require a person to physically move a cable to connect the call, did so because his funeral home wasn't getting any customers. The lady operating the switchboard was the wife of his rival and was redirecting the calls to her husband. Instead of complaining to the phone company, which would have probably gotten her fired if they found sufficient evidence, he took matters into his own hands and made her entire job obsolete. Dr. Barry Marshall for infecting himself with H. pylori to prove they were the cause of ulcers. He earned a Nobel Prize for his efforts. Seriously, go watch old TV shows and movies. There's always some guy chugging Pepto or mainlining ulcer medicine because they're 5 minutes past the deadline. Dr. Marshall killed the billion-dollar ulcer medicine industry. Wikipedia passage about the U.S. soldier Audie Murphy at the Colmar Pocket in World War II. The Germans scored a direct hit on an M10 tank destroyer, setting it alight, forcing the crew to abandon it. Murphy ordered his men to retreat to positions in the woods, remaining alone at his post, shooting his M1 carbine and directing artillery fire via his field radio while the Germans aimed fire directly at his position. Murphy mounted the abandoned, burning tank destroyer and began firing its .50 caliber machine gun at the advancing Germans, killing his squad crawling through a ditch towards him. For an hour, Murphy stood on the flaming tank destroyer returning German fire from foot soldiers and advancing tanks, killing or wounding 50 Germans. He sustained a leg wound during his stand, and stopped only after he ran out of ammunition. Murphy rejoined his men, disregarding his own injury, and led them back to repel the Germans. He insisted on remaining with his men while his wounds were treated. He was 19 years old when this occurred. North Korea attempted to hack someone who used to do cybersecurity for the Department of Defense in an attempt to steal some of his hacking software. He notified the FBI, and after waiting a year for nothing to come of it, he decided to hack into servers and routers of North Korea and effectively took down their internet as well as virtually all of their sites for many days. Newton inventing calculus. He was trying to solve problems that were unsolvable or very tedious to solve. Instead of trying to solve them with the help of his peers, he simply invented a new branch of mathematics to solve them. And then he basically discarded his invention after he achieved his goal because he moved on to other problems. Later there were rumblings about a new way to solve problems, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I did that years ago, it's in some of my journals over there." General Vladimir Pikolov didn't want his men exposed to radiation during the Chernobyl disaster, so he personally drove around the perimeter of the power plant to get exact radiation levels and exposing himself to 137 rems. A lot of people think that this was just a part of the show, but this man really made a necessary sacrifice and should be acknowledged as a hero. I've told this story before, but I went to the dentist many years ago to have a rotten tooth pulled. The dentist, who was highly skilled and qualified, numbed me up, grabbed the pliers, attached them to the tooth and pulled. Nothing happened. It didn't help that she was pretty small and simply didn't have the strength to do it. She apologized and said she'd go and get a beefier colleague, but I'd have to wait for half an hour since the other dentist was out at lunch. I said fuck that, I'd do it myself. So she put the pliers over my tooth. I checked with her about 5 times that it was the correct tooth, and gave it an almighty yank. Finally, out popped the tooth. It turns out the reason it was so recalcitrant was that it had 3 roots instead of just 2. Anyway, I got a discount of £2.50 for doing the job myself.